What you see on the table in front of you is everything you need to make a batch of tender flake pastry. I'm just going to go through the different items to explain what they are and how they're to be used in the recipe, and then we'll go through the actual stages of how to create your pastry. First thing I'll talk to you about is the egg here. I do need one egg for the recipe. Now you're going to have to separate the egg, so you have a choice. You can separate it with an egg separator, or you can just use the egg shell to separate. It depends on what your preference is. Either works fine. You do need a couple of measuring spoons. We need a teaspoon to measure out some salt. We do need a tablespoon to measure out some vinegar. This larger measuring spoon or measuring cup is a 1 cup measuring cup, and I use this to measure out the flour. We do need 4 cups of flour for this recipe. This bowl is going to be used to beat the egg white stiff. We don't want it to dry out, but we do want the egg white to become stiffened to help with the binding of the pastry. We need a spoon to stir the flour and salt mixture right out of the gate, so we just can get any type of spoon, wood or metal works, whatever you have on hand. Some people like to cut pastry or cut their fat or their vegetable shortening in with a pastry knife. This is a pastry knife my mom bought for me for Christmas. I used it a couple times. It's in relatively great shape because I never use it anymore. I do prefer the old method of just using 2 knives to cut into the paste, to cut the shortening into the flour. It's a really basic technique, and we'll cover that a little better later on. You should have a measuring cup to measure out the water. You need 1 cup of water for this recipe, so I use purified water because any chance you get to put a high quality ingredient into cooking, I think it's in your best interest if you have it available. You also need, as mentioned before, a tablespoon of vinegar. Just get basic pure white vinegar. Don't add other types of vinegar. It'll turn the taste of your pastry, so nothing fancy there. As mentioned before, we do need a teaspoon of table salt. Just regular table salt's fine. I'm not positive whether the granulation or the coarseness of sea salt would affect the recipe, so I don't bother with it, even though it's just a teaspoon of it. I don't think it'll hurt you just to use regular table salt in this case. The fat that goes into this pastry recipe is simple Crisco. Make sure you buy the blue box. If you happen to use the yellow box, it's a butter infused Crisco shortening, and it does work for this recipe, but I don't think the results are as favorable as they are with traditional blue vegetable shortening. The flour I like to use for this recipe is Robin Hood Best for Blending flour. I just find it mixes really well. You get reduced clumps, and it seems to work really well for this recipe. Again, all-purpose flour would be fine, but if you want to make this process as easy as possible, Best for Blending seems to be the trick. This is the bowl that all of the mixing will occur in. Try to find a large enough bowl that you can work with it inside without having to worry about it coming out the sides. There's not a lot of blending within the bowl, but you do need room to put your hands and your arms in there and work with the pastry lightly, so make sure you give yourself enough of a bowl to do that in. A couple times during the recipe you'll be asked to mix something. I just use a basic, cheap hand mixer with the obvious associated utensils, so you should have one of those for beating the egg yolk vinegar water mixture, as well as beating the egg white to a stiff texture. This bowl here is where I will do the egg yolk vinegar water blending. Give yourself a big enough bowl here because you do add a cup of water and an egg yolk with vinegar, and it sometimes can overwhelm a small cereal bowl, so I use a little bit of a bigger bowl for this part of the recipe. And then when you're done making your pastry, it's in your best interest to rest it in the fridge, so I use just plastic wrap to do that. I end up cutting the pastry recipe in half and putting both clumps into their own packages, and I like it to rest at least an hour in the fridge to help everything bind better, so that it's easier to work with when you go to roll out your pie crust. Okay, the first part of the recipe is to just measure out 4 cups of flour. Pretty basic concept. I just put my flour in a container, so it's really easy to mix or to measure out. So basically I'm going to take my 1 cup scooper, and a lot of people say you have to be extremely precise in baking, and that's true in a lot of cases, but when you're making pastry, just get her close. Some people sift their flour, but again, for pastry I think a little bit of texture is not a terrible thing, so I don't think it's that important to sift your flour. This is actually more than I usually do for measuring flour, but this is what you're supposed to do apparently when you bake, is you're supposed to scrape the top with a knife to make sure you have relatively an accurate cup each time. So I'm measuring 4 cups of flour. It's quite a bit of flour, to be honest, which speaks to why you can make 2 full pies with this recipe. So don't cheat the recipe of its flour. You'll be adding more later. That's roughly 4 cups of flour. So now we're done with that measuring bowl. We can put our flour aside. We will need it later when we're trying to roll the mixture up into a ball. So the next stage is to measure in a teaspoon of salt, essentially. I never measure it right over the bowl of flour. I usually do it over a separate bowl because I don't know if you've ever used these these Windsor salt boxes. They're sometimes really hard to be accurate with, so I usually do it over a bowl so I can be a little bit inaccurate and not have it come back to haunt me. So that's roughly a teaspoon. Again, shake a little bit off, put it in your flour mixture. I'll get rid of that extra salt somewhere else. Now I'm done with salt, essentially. So when I'm finished with an ingredient, I like to move it aside, or if I'm finished with a tool, I like to move it aside, because you do need lots of room to work here, because you're going to be manipulating your pastry quite a bit during the actual process. So after you put your salt in, the instructions suggest you should be stirring it into your flour. We're not asking you to blend this with an electric device at all. We're asking you to try and circulate that lone teaspoon of salt throughout the 4 cups of flour that you've placed it in. Okay, so that's relatively well done. The next stage of our recipe is to get out our shortening. So I have the shortening resting in the freezer because I like it to remain really cold. So it's really important to have your shortening and your water as cold as possible, and it's important at this point to keep moving in your recipe because you'd like to get things done before those key ingredients warm up too much. So shortening comes in a nicely wrapped little wax paper bundle. It's just vegetable shortening. Lots of debate out there whether vegetable shortening or butter, or there's positives on both sides. I like both recipes. I find this one, if you're just learning to make pastry, relatively easy to do because it's not as fussy as butter, but butter does taste very good as well. So once you have the shortening in your bowl, this is where you get to choose your tool. This is a pastry knife essentially here. Some people like to use it. This is what it looks like when you start manipulating your mixture with it. I don't like it because it shoots up your knuckles, and so that's about as long as I can tolerate using a pastry knife. I much prefer the old-fashioned method, which is just simply using 2 butter knives, and then you're not so messy because you don't have to get your hands in there to keep cleaning it. So you just take your 2 butter knives like this, blades down essentially, and you're going to do a cross pattern. You're just going to keep doing this until you've cut the actual shortening into the mixture. Okay, so you can do some rough cutting first just to get it moving a little bit, but you'll see once we get a little further into this process, you're not going to be wanting to use just 1 blade at a time. You're going to be wanting to do the crisscrossing pattern that I showed you earlier. So we're reaching that stage now where we'd like to be crisscrossing to create the cutting motion that we talked about. Okay, so we're just kneading it across like this. This is the stage where it gets sort of fun because you're actually cutting across quite consistently, and you're seeing that what you're doing is having a positive impact on the shortening. You can see the sizes of the shortening decreasing, the clumps are decreasing, and you can see that some of your flour has become attached to the pieces of shortening. And that's the key, is to keep doing this method until you get that consistency that you're looking for. A lot of people make the mistake at this stage where they manipulate the shortening too much and it gets a creamy texture. At this stage, we like the texture of it to simply be what they call granulated. So it looks like it has little clumps of shortening in it rather than a creamy uniform texture. The bigger the clumps you leave, the more potential there is for flakiness, because when you do roll this out, clumps of shortening will create subtle little air pockets, and it will allow the crust to have a sense of flakiness about it. So it's kind of a neat concept to not have to over manipulate your fat in your pastry to encourage it to be what most people suggest is more desirable. I do find pastry that's light and flaky much more desirable than I do dense or somewhat greasy textured pastry. I find if you over manipulate your flour and your fat, that the end result ends up usually being a dense pastry that's overly greasy. So we're getting really close here. You can see the chunks of flour, or sorry, the chunks of flour coated pastry are getting to be a little more uniform. And again, the technique is very simple. I'm just going cross like this, okay, and I'm going through the flour like that, and it just creates a uniform concept. So if you were using your pastry cutter at this point, it would start to look like this. You're just doing the same sort of thing, but you're putting your knuckles in and you're just doing a slight little twist like this. A lot of people prefer this, but again, when I'm baking, I'd like to keep my knuckles relatively clean. I don't really like having grease or shortening or fat all over my knuckles. So again, I don't prefer this method. I do prefer the knife method. Nonetheless, both work, so whatever your preference is up to you. So now the texture of this mixture is what I would consider ideal for what we're doing. And at this point, we have to start manipulating our egg so we can put our egg in to start binding this together. Okay, so we take our egg. If you want to separate the egg into a couple different bowls. This is my egg. I'll show you the egg separator. I basically crack the egg, grab it. Actually, just give me one sec here. If I'm using the egg separator, which I usually don't do, but I thought just in case you were curious you'd like to see it, I usually crack the egg, pour it in the egg separator, get rid of the shell, and you'll notice that the white does fall through the holes in the egg separator. And all I do from that point is I just shake to the side a bit, and I look to get that last goop out of the way. So my egg white is in my bowl, and then I put my egg yolk in my second bowl. So I've decided to use 2 metal bowls, so here's my egg yolk into the second bowl. Okay, so I have my egg separated, the egg separator is done. I have my 2 bowls, one an egg white and one an egg yolk. That's the ideal situation that we're looking for. So what we have to do now is we have to basically put the water and we have to put the vinegar inside of the bowl containing the egg yolk. So we're going to set aside the egg white for a second, and we're going to work on the egg yolk. So I'm going to go get my fresh water out of the fridge because I'm keeping it cold. And again, I'm only using a cup of water, so I'm going to measure it out into a measuring glass. Pretty basic, obviously. Okay, that's roughly a cup. So I pour it into my egg yolk mixture. The second item I need to put in that mixture is a tablespoon of vinegar. So once again, I bring back my mixing spill or measuring spillover bowl, and I bring my vinegar in my tablespoon. Just in case I'm not accurate, I measure over top of a bowl. I don't mind extra stuff going in. So I'm going to squirt a tablespoon of vinegar here, pretty good. Put it in my egg yolk mixture. At this point, I'm done with my tablespoon. I'm going to put that aside. Now I'm going to work on mixing up my egg yolk. Okay, so I'm going to use my hand mixer this time. We don't need to overly manipulate this. We just need to slowly mix this up. Okay, nothing crazy here. It is an egg yolk, so we don't need to over mix this. Okay, so we can leave those there. And now we can put this mixture inside of our actual pastry bowl. So the key part of this time is we use one of our knives essentially to stir this into the mixture of salt, flour, and shortening. So here's the bowl we're going to put it in, and I'm going to take one of my pastry knives that I've been using, and I'm going to pour it in, and I'm going to stir as I go. So this is what's going to hydrate our pastry. This is the basic binding agent that's going to allow our pastry to adhere to itself essentially, and you just use one knife. They don't want you using a big spoon because they want you to promote circulation throughout the mixture. so that everything receives some of the moisture. That's really key to making this into dough and taking it away from being that granulated texture that we started with. So essentially we've used all of the mixture. Now I'm going to very thoroughly, without over manipulating the mixture, I'm going to try and circulate it throughout to kind of soak up some of those dry bits that I'm seeing in the bottom of this mixture. So as you can see, as I started doing this, is taking on sort of a Play-Doh texture. This is a good thing. It's sort of a desirable texture that's happening here. It means the egg and the water and the vinegar are doing their job. They're helping to bind all of the ingredients together, creating what we're looking for, which is a cohesive basic ball of pastry that we can use to make our pie. Okay, so this isn't looking too bad here. Again, you don't want to overmix your pastry because you don't want to get any of the gluten started in the flour. You don't want it to become overly glutinous because then it becomes tough and undesirable. Okay, so that's probably enough manipulation at that point. The next stage of this recipe is to quickly take that egg yolk, or sorry, egg white, and you're going to beat it stiff. Now you can beat an egg white into a dry mixture, and that's something we have to avoid. We don't want it to become dry, but we do want it to stiffen. So very quickly you're going to put some high-speed beater into the egg white, and you're going to give it a good mix. Okay, so starting to foam. This is where we have to be careful. Getting sort of a nice frothy texture. It's not dry yet, but it's becoming more and more the texture that we're looking for. Hey, that's perfect right there. I like that texture. We basically take that egg white and we're going to mix that into our pastry bowl essentially. So I don't know if you can get a good look at that, but that's what it looks like when you have the right texture. And we'll show you that again. So I just take my spoon and I basically pour the egg white mixture into the pastry, and then I just what's called fold it in. So all I'm doing is taking large clumps and I'm folding the egg white inside of the pastry mixture. You're not going to get all of it, but it is going to give some lift and give some air to your pastry. It's going to help it with its light flakiness, as we mentioned before, which is a desirable texture for pastry. So the egg white at the end is essential because it will allow us to infuse some air into our pastry to make it a lighter texture. Okay, so I've just simply folded that into my pastry mixture, and at this point I'm done manipulating the pastry. I don't want to work it much more because again we don't want to activate those glutens. Okay, so I can put my spoon aside. You need to bring your flour back into the mix at this point because you're going to need some flour. Your job at this point is to sort of ball up the pastry. Again, don't over manipulate. This is the fun. This is where it gets tempting to be a pizza maker and overwork the pastry. You're not kneading pastry like you would bread dough or pizza dough. You're essentially just putting a bit of pressure on the mass of pastry so you can force it or help it cohere to itself. So you can create a ball that we can then portion and we can separate. So that looks like a pretty good piece of pastry that we'll be able to work with. Okay, so again, I'm not over manipulating. I'm just trying to promote cohesion between the ingredients so that we have something we can roll out later to create a nice pie crust. So at that point, you're going to throw some flour on top because you always want flour to help it be easily manipulated. So I just put it in the bowl and I'll just toss it around a bit. Again, helps bring it together without over manipulating, but then it makes it a lot easier to work with as well. Okay, so that's basically how you make pastry. Takes about 10 minutes if you do it properly. Any more time and you're probably letting your ingredients get too warm, or you're not prepared ahead of time to actually use all the ingredients that you need. At this point, because I know the recipe will cover 2 pies, I essentially just cut the pastry in half with my same pastry stirring knife or my pastry cutting knife, and then I'm going to take my plastic wrap and I'm going to wrap each of the portions up and place them in the fridge overnight or for at least an hour so that they can become properly set. It's a lot easier to work with pastry after it's had some time to rest. A lot like other doughs that are yeast-based there, you have to let the yeast bloom and things like that. Pastries loves to have some time to set. That's beautiful there. You can see the texture there. That's going to be nice flaky pastry. Okay, so haven't made pastry for almost a year, and guess what? It's still easily done if you follow the instructions and you remember a few basic concepts. So make sure you don't leave any holes in your wrap here, otherwise your pastry will dry out, and that would be tragic because all of that wonderful effort you've just made would be in vain. So after you wrap it up, basically, I always put it in a sandwich bag as well, so I'm going to leave that aside. I'll wrap the second one up, and then we're done our lesson on making pastry. I don't find plastic wrap the easiest thing to work with personally, but okay, still a bit of flour there, so I can put a bit on there as well. The pastry is already well formed, so you don't have to worry about diluting the fat with flour at this point. It's already done its job by being cut into the shortening. Okay, that's it. In the sandwich bags they go, and in the fridge they will rest.